Well, welcome to a deeper dig of the Small Farms Winter Webinar Series. These bonus episodes are meant to continue each week's webinar topic in conversations with members of the local foods and small farms team, commercial ag, and that week's presenter. In this informal chat, we'll talk about the week's topic, answer lingering questions, and hear more from our speaker. I'm Grant McCarty, local food and small farms educator for Joe Davis, Stevenson, and Winnebago counties. I'm joined by Bronwyn Ailey, local foods and small farms educator for Gallatin, Hamilton, Hardin, Pope, Saline, and White counties. How are the high tunnels today, Bronwyn?
They're warming up. It's 85 degrees and sunny here, so it's feeling pretty warm and toasty in there. Tomatoes are growing really quickly, so it's good.
Nice. And what week are you on with those tomatoes? Are you a month in with the planting?
Not quite. I think we're at 3 weeks.
All right, so just getting there.
they have their first string, and they're starting to size some fruit on the first cluster and setting second cluster. So I think we'll be putting on a second string probably the end of this week. So.
Oh, nice. Well, glad they're moving right ahead. We do not plant tomatoes until the week before Memorial Day weekend up north. So that's where we're at.
You're going to say the 4th of July.
4th of July in some years, right? Go ahead.
We were a couple of weeks behind in setting them out. Normally we set out around the 1st of April, and I think it was around the 12th or 13th. So we were a little behind this year.
A little behind. Well, you just heard a little bit from one of our other speakers today. Nathan Johanning is a commercial ag educator for Madison, Monroe, and St. Clair counties. How's it down there too, Nathan?
Oh, it's pretty nice. It's just glad it's not raining. So that is one nice thing about the high tunnels, right? You can at least avoid some of the rain. We've been kind of wet, but I think we're going to switch from being kind of wet to kind of hot. So I don't know. I've heard weather forecasts for the next, today's upper 80s, and then like record breaking like 95 the next 3 days or something. So
gosh, yeah, I think we're going to be in the 90s toward the end of the week up here. So that's very unusual for us. And then finally, we're joined by Katie Bell, local foods and small farms educator for Franklin, Jackson, Perry, Randolph, and Williamson County. Katie, how's asparagus this year? How's it been so far?
Doing good. It's growing like crazy now, especially, it's been overcast, so it's slowed down a little bit, but now that the sun's coming out and we're also expecting 90s, it's been growing pretty rapidly.
So this week's topic is a little different way of how we're going to talk about it today. This is actually with me. We're talking about grape production and growing great grapes. When we talk about something like grape production, it's one of those things where I think, do some of us have experience with grape production? I'm just kind of curious.
I do, some.
I have none, so.
None. What about you, Bronwyn? Any grape production experience?
Yeah, I think there was a small vineyard started here at the station, and I think they set it out in 1998 or 99. And so the first probably 4 or 5 years that I was working as a research specialist at Dixon Springs, we had a grape planting. There were table grapes, and a few of the wine grapes in there as well. So the system that I was used to was the single cordon system. We did not do a lot with the as far as measuring how much we pruned off and things like that. We didn't do a lot of the more technical side of pruning. Mostly we were just trying to keep the foliage down because of in our region with the humidity, black rot is such a problem for us. So we're just trying to do as much pruning as we could to keep that in check. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that this topic of grape production, I was very fortunate that, the unit I'm in, Joe Davis County, has a very large vineyard production system. And many of them are, a close-knit community and close-knit group of learning how to grow grapes and developing, best practices and utilizing research from Wisconsin and Minnesota. But I think it's also important, we have to recognize the work of Elizabeth Wally, because Elizabeth's work in grape production, while she's in Southern Illinois, gosh, she is really covering the whole state. I think also, is there SIU doing some work in grapes production too?
Yeah, Brad Taylor at SIU does a lot of some viticulture research, and they had a research vineyard down at Carbondale, and worked a lot with like the Shawnee Wine Trail and all the wineries in that area, which are kind of between Bronwyn and I, basically right around Katy. So she lives kind of in the heart of that area. So yeah, whenever I have a few grapes at home, but probably just, well, about the time, a little after Bronwyn's experiences with grapes, whenever I was in grad school, I floated around to various things, but I worked in the research vineyard, and I helped out with some data collection and pruning, and had some endeavors, most of which revolved around Dr. Taylor and his work, which is always fun and a little bit crazy. So yeah, that's been at least some of my experience with there. So
yeah, I'm on my second year with 3 plants in the backyard. So they're all very cold hardy varieties from Minnesota. I think one is a wine grape, and then the other 2 are table grapes. So I'm now that second year where it's like trying to establish that a good strong cane, so that then probably the third year is when I will have kind of the cane extension. So I should say, not establishing the cane, establishing the trunk. That's really what I'm after this first couple of years. And then we'll get that cane established. And like Bronwyn just mentioned, just kind of a single cordon is kind of what I'm trying to aim for. We'll see how it goes with grape growing.
Grapes are at least a little more easily manipulated than like fruit trees, apple trees, and you can kind of twist the vines to kind of get them to go where you want. Sometimes I've had fruit trees where they're just not going to grow in that shape. You're just going to gotta kind of work with them. They don't put on branches where you want them. You're just kind of work with what they give you. But yeah, grapes are always fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that, for folks that are just getting started with grapes, is that there is sometimes the ability to start over a little easier, since sometimes 90% of that wood is coming off every year with pruning. So if you have set up this beautiful trellis and you think that it's going to work, and then say you have disease pressure come in and just kind of wipes it out, you could potentially start back at square one and start back to that trunk, especially for something that's going to potentially live up to 30 years if all the conditions are there.
Yeah, I think, in some cases, on some of the like commercial plantings, they'll go and of course even just renew and renovate, and just basically chop stuff off and just grow a new trunk and cordons, and just basically go basically rebuild it, kind of sacrifice, especially if you get trunks or you get dead sections in the cordons that aren't don't have good buds on them, and so yeah, that's yeah, it is. Grapes are a little more forgiving. You can't quite always do that with like a peach tree or something. I mean, there are some cases, but not quite as easily or as common. I have seen in orchard cases where they would actually like basically high cut and then regraft and start from new, but that's yeah, definitely more work than just cutting off a grapevine and and just reestablishing some of the structure.
Yeah, I mean, I think too, when this webinar was developed, it was something that I had been looking at over a couple of years, because we had a number of individuals coming to the extension office asking, to grow grapes and get started. And I think one of the challenges with understanding grapes is that there's a whole group of vocabulary that goes into it, and understanding the different terminologies, the structure, and then also recognizing too that if you're going to pursue growing grapes for vineyard or for winemaking on a scale, that you're going to have to be doing a little bit more pruning in the summer than maybe you were really expecting, and that fungicide plan and disease management is such a huge piece of it too.
So we've kind of talked about, you're in the way farther north than the rest of us on the call. Are there big differences in the pruning practices of grapes just generally in your area in comparison to where Bronwyn kind of mentioned earlier that we're a lot more humid down here. Are there differences with that or not?
It's a good question. I mean, there may be some differences, but I think that for some of these diseases like black rot and the mildews, we would still see similar kind of pruning practices. I still feel like I see, the rows of cordons and the spurs for wine production as you would see it in Southern Illinois too. There might be perhaps more vigorous shoot thinning that happens in Southern Illinois just to maybe help with better airflow compared to what we might see up here. But I would still say for the most part, the practices are, pretty similar.
I remember from some of the questions that were coming through the chat when you were delivering the webinar, and I made a note because you talked about the cordon spur versus the traditional, the two types of pruning methods. And, there were some questions specifically about a couple of those things within the chat. But one thing that we kept going back to within the webinar was, the labor of the pruning itself. But I think maybe if you could touch on some other benefits from that, like the ease of spray, how much more effective a spray program can be or more efficient, in kind of comparing those two different training systems a little bit. And then also maybe as far as when you get ready to harvest, is there some ease in the labor of harvest between those two systems?
Yeah, no, great question. Yeah, I mean, really what I found with just kind of, an introduction to grape production is that you just have to divide it up into two directions. You have to either do the cordon direction where you have this like established extension of the trunk, or you have to do the cane production where you have a trunk and then at a certain place you have canes that develop every year. And it's those canes in the wintertime that you are trellising and supporting. When we look at then say from like wine production or wine grapes rather, and fresh eating, wine grapes tend to be more beneficial on the cordon. And I think this gets a lot to the labor for the cordon, because if I have an established cordon running down a row, my pruning is finding the spurs and I'm pruning to a number of canes per spur. So it's a very like efficient way of kind of moving down a row compared to say like cane pruning where I have this hairball or a mess of canes that I have to untangle, and then I have to select, 3 or 4 from it to then be able to get grapes that season. So from like a pruning standpoint, looking at both of those, the cordon's going to be a little bit easier and probably less expensive because of the labor standpoint. And then, if we look at the cane system, that might be a little bit better, smaller scale for homeowners or small scale production for table grapes, for instance. The spray system it's a great point you bring up, Ron, because if you're thinking about spraying fungicides or anything like that, in my opinion, I think your cordon system is going to be more efficient because it's just more compact, it's more narrow in the row. And the other thing we didn't really get into with this great presentation was that netting becomes a big piece of this puzzle, where if you're on a certain scale, you're going to need to invest in high quality bird netting. And really like cordon system works really well to put that bird netting in place compared to say canes where the trellising might be a little bit bigger. Picking wise, I still think cordon will be a little bit more efficient just based on kind of where those spurs are and where the fruit is. But still it would depend on what you're growing with it. So at the end of the day, is it all a wash? Not really, but I think that it still depends on what your labor situation is and what your goals are, where labor is probably going to be a bit more efficient on a cordon, a little bit more laborious on the cane system.
So then what is the advantage to the cane system, or is that more of a traditional approach?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think of the cane as a very traditional approach. Like if I had a gazebo, if I had a big structure, I would do a cane system where I would like try to, this first 3 years of established, I'm trying to get my trunk as tall as it can be, and then have canes kind of trellising over a structure like a gazebo. So aesthetically, it's going to look wonderful. Of course, we don't talk about disease that might come in, and then you're eating, you have a family barbecue under your gazebo and diseased grapes above you. We don't talk about that. But I think also for table grapes, you're just going to be more efficient on the cane system. And so like a smaller scale, it's going to be easier to do it. The cordon does get tricky. I mean, it's certainly something where you have to really have a good grasp of your grape structure, because that cordon is only going to live 6 to 7 years. So you have to have in mind how you are going to have a replacement for that cordon after some time. It still is something where, you can learn, by year 6 or year 7, you probably have a good idea of that grape structure. But I would still say that would be something that it will work fine for table grapes, the cordon, but you may not get as many yields as you would compared to a cane system with it too.
I would definitely agree with that. When we had the small vineyard here on site that was a mix of both wine grapes and table grapes, everything was just trained to the single cordon system. And I think we probably could have seen better yields on the table grapes if they had been trained differently. And even some of the different varieties of wine grapes could have been on a different system, whether it was a double cordon versus a single. I think, we definitely could have seen increases in yields if we had trained them on different systems. But for our purposes, it was just easier to have everything on one system, as far as when you're going through and establishing your trellis, which can be pretty costly, and you need to, there's quite a bit to making sure you're putting in a trellis that could last up to 30 years for the planting, and support the weight of the crop, as well as having the netting that you're going to put on to keep the birds out. And so for our purposes, just that singles trellising system worked best for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if someone was coming into my extension office and they wanted to grow grapes, I think the first question, then is it wine or is it going to be table grapes? And then from there, you kind of will shift towards more of a cordon for wine grape, and then more of a general kind of trellis cane structure for your table grapes. Depending on, of course, like what your scale is and what your goals are with it too.
I was just going to say that we've talked about, the trellising system and how that kind of plays into disease management, but what diseases are you managing for? You've talked a little bit about the black rot and stuff, but then also what other diseases are we looking for? And then how would we manage those, as far as whether we're talking fungicides or cultural control?
Yeah, I mean, this is a plant that has really heavily destructive diseases. I think that it's, if you're looking for a plant that's, especially on a scale that you don't want to invest in spray equipment or fungicide programs for, this is not your crop. It gets hit really hard with black rot, which sometimes is seen, May to July. It will develop mummies. This black rot will, and kind of shrivel up some of the canes. Powdery mildew can affect things all season long on that leaf material. It also overwinters pretty regularly on leaf material too. So these are diseases, and those are just two. There's so many more out there, and I think one of the other factors within this is that this is also a plant getting so many diseases that one can hit early and then has opened up these wounds for another one to move in and another one to potentially move in too. And I think that's one of the main things I really hear from maybe newer beginning grape growers that are just putting out an acre and have invested all of this infrastructure in there, is that they really did not recognize that the amount of fungicide application that was going to be required to go into grape production. Yeah, there's still good cultural practices that can work well. Disease-free, disease-resistant cultivars, making sure you have an area that has really good airflow, making sure that you're pruning correctly and trellising correctly for airflow to also occur. I think that's where something like a very large trellis system or some infrastructure that maybe looks great when the grapes are growing and yet could impede some of that airflow from really happening would be something to try to avoid if you could, or expect to maybe prune and trellis a different way. This is also one where you might consider doing some shoot and fruit thinning in the summertime too, to kind of balance out the vine, as well as to help with airflow, disease management. And then of course, if you had them, near wild grapevines, we would not recommend that either. Removing the wild grapevines where it could harbor. So the cultural practice are a little bit similar to some of our other crops. It's just that sometimes we might be able to get away with a smaller application of a fungicide for smaller crops compared to grapes, where the season is so long, and you also find that it's just hit hard really with these diseases.
I think personally for me, like black rot has always been one that's, and I have a few table grapes at home, and that's, they do get sprayed some, but probably, I don't know, probably could use a little more care to really do. It's just enough that it's not worth maybe always, or I don't get the time dedicated to them they need. But it's enough that they need a little attention. Yeah, it seemed like we'll always hit just a wet spell midsummer, and yeah, it just seems like they just kind of, the black rot explodes and probably has more vine growth than it needs. And yeah, definitely the shoot thinning and air canopy management is really important when you get to that scale.
Yeah, and fortunately, there are you will occasionally find some varieties that have some good disease resistance. I think you have to match that up with if these are going to be grown to potentially support your own vineyard or to sell to wineries in the area, then you would want to match that up. But there aren't as many out there as we might expect with it either. So yeah, it's just kind of being mindful of what maybe your expectations are with fruit as well, and then what you're really capable of managing and handling.
So you have a few grapes you want to expand on. How's your best recommendation as far as propagating grapes?
Yeah, I know we got this question some in our webinar, and I think that there is potential to propagate. I think it is one thing that we just have to be kind of considerate of doing a sort of propagation, where we're, in this scenario where we might be taking a cutting from the plant, potentially a cane, just having a cane cutting and then propagating it. It is important to recognize that some of these varieties are patented. Some of these Minnesota hardy varieties and others have a patent to them, and that patent does not allow for you to do any sort of propagation. I think the other thing to recognize is that sometimes yet again, we're back to disease, where pathogens could overwinter in parts of that plant material. So it's being very mindful of that as you're doing some kind of propagation from this. There's a couple strategies. One of the ones we see is, you take a couple of cane cuttings during the dormant season. These should be about 14 to 16 inches long. They have maybe 2 to 3 buds on them. And then you could store them back for a period of time, say your refrigerator, before you then potentially plant them in the springtime when temperatures are around 55 to 60 degrees. You could use a rooting hormone where you would dip that cutting into it and then put into a growing area. You could also do that as more of like a mini nursery, if you will. So you could take multiple cuttings, dip them in the rooting growth hormone, and then have a little area where you would space them a little bit closer together, with the main goal being that you're just trying to get them to root. This isn't going to be their permanent forever home. Basically a nursery, right? You have a little mini nursery somewhere on your area, in your growing area. They tend to advise not to get cuttings with, say, 6 to 7 buds. You really are just after 2 to 3. There's another camp that their approach to propagation is a little bit different. It's actually, you are pruning in the wintertime, you're taking the cuttings, yet again, 14 to 16 inches, 2 to 3 buds, and then you're immediately putting them into the ground. And usually you have most of the buds are buried except for a single one that's exposed. So there's routes to go both of those directions to go with it, with these cuttings off the canes. I think it will just depend on playing around with it more than anything. It would be very difficult, I think, in Northern Illinois to do a cutting during dormancy and just putting it right into the ground. First off, it's still frozen. It's still frozen, but it would be something that probably might work a little bit better in Southern Illinois, or even, you know, parts of Southern Central Illinois. I think what we would really recognize is taking a cutting in the wintertime, keeping it in the fridge for a while, and then in spring, kind of doing a different burial rather, with that cutting, with it.
I've done a few where, again, I could see where definitely there are geographical locations could change that. But yeah, if it's, you know, a nice warm day, and you know, especially if you like later pruning, maybe February, maybe early March, and I've tried to patch, you know, lost a vine or something somewhere, and I would, you know, prune a piece and just pop it in the ground, leave a note or two, bud or two above ground, and I actually started, actually most of the vines I have were some that I started from some prunings. But yeah, it definitely, I think the one time I did actually what you mentioned is the nursery. You know, I put some in a small area, kind of put them, you know, maybe, you know, just, you know, I don't know, a few inches apart, you know, a little area just to get them started, and then kind of go from there. But lately I've kind of even thought, like, well, if I just have a couple, let's just, rather than trying to go with the nursery, let's just take, or here's where I want this vine, we'll stick one in, see what happens. And certainly I think it's a way that a person can try to fill them in. Sometimes you have success, sometimes you don't, but if nothing else, it can be gratifying, just that experience of knowing you created this plant on your own. That alone can be a, you know, gratifying experience versus just always, you know, clicking the, you know, order button. So
right, and you've got so much material coming off in the pruning that it's like, well, you know, if I could just replicate this and do it. With your, Nathan, when you've done like the smaller plantings, you just space them close together, how long are they staying in that growing area?
I think the one time I did that, I think I did leave them I think I may have left them, I don't remember if I took them out, if I left them a year, or if I just let them kind of establish and then transplanted them. I wouldn't say I struggle with transplanting things. The reason I switched more towards, you know, the non-nursery route, unless you were doing like a large quantity to set out, was just the thought of, all right, so half of the battle is transplant shock with almost any kind of planting, right? So if I'm just planting them in the ground anyhow, and if I have a, you know, fairly secure area, you know, keep wildlife and things away from them, and I can just do it right where it needs to be, then I'm just avoiding that shock of trying to transplant it and get it reestablished again. But yeah, I don't remember. I will be honest, I don't exactly remember. I want to say that maybe I kind of established them for a year and then kind of cut them back and then pulled them out the next dormant season. Because I know I'm always just personally reluctant, you know, things like that. Once they've leafed out, trying to move them, I haven't always had the best experiences. They like, once they're growing and they're using lots of water, it just, I've been challenged by trying to get, you know, perennial plants like that to take well if you're digging them up, if they're not like pre-potted or something else, that you can just pull them out real easy. It seems like you tend to, you do more destruction to the roots, and they're actively growing and leading that root system. And so that's kind of been my thought process. I think, yeah, just waiting till the next year, kind of cut them back a little bit to something manageable, and then set them out if I use that nursery scenario.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking too. Like, I think that would be, I'd want to give them like a year, or, to kind of establish themselves before, like you said, kind of moving them to another place. Just because to me, in my mind, I just think that'd be really important to make sure those roots are really well established and kind of used to those kind of growing conditions with it. Yeah, because right now the 3 plants that I have are kind of in a modified raised bed, so they're kind of running down a single row, and so I don't necessarily have the ability to spread them out just yet. But I think that it's something to consider, especially what I see with all the pruning. It's just so much material that I could be able to do that.
Yeah, it's definitely easy to get plenty of material to establish them and start some new ones. So
yeah, I mean, especially compared to, say, apple trees, right, where you have to purchase the root stock, you have to then do a graft, and sometimes the graft takes, sometimes it doesn't. I mean, with the grape situation, at least, you're able to really propagate it much easier.
So when you're talking about having your nursery and I was thinking about like small plants and stuff, it made me think about, do you have issues with like deer or rabbit damage to any grapes, but especially like if you're trying to start young ones?
Yeah, I mean, if you are starting a vineyard, or kind of an area where you're going to plant your grapes, you will commonly get them as bare root, and typically they are in this deer protection sleeve. Like, you can see these newly established ones sometimes when you drive around, where that first year they're really protected from the deer to ensure that they will not get eaten by them. So for deer protection, that would be something that the first couple years that you have that protection from. But on a big scale, you may find you need some deer fencing, and then you need to really invest in some deer fencing. I'm unsure, sometimes we see with orchards where they are hanging Irish spring soap or other kind of deterrents around their apple trees. It could also work pretty well for deer, perhaps. There's also some research from, or rather, that could work pretty well for grapes, is what I'm getting at. There is also some research that, certainly a deer fence can be really expensive, but there's also these micro enclosures where you're almost using like hog paneling, and it's like 16 feet by 16 feet as your kind of square. And that kind of micro enclosure may actually keep deer from getting to your grapes. Now, keep in mind, like, that is not, especially depending on how many grapes you have, that's a pretty small area. So you may not be able to fully encapsulate all of your grapes. But certainly I would try to start with some deer proof kind of deterrent with the tube, and then see if any of those kind of smelling deterrents that you see out there might work okay with them. As far as rabbits, we know that they're really going to go towards those very vulnerable parts of the grapevine as it gets started. So depending on how big that bare root is, you may need to put up some additional fencing just for rabbit protection. This is also a time where, especially if you think about mulching, a lot of times you see grapes that are pretty bare ground around them, because certainly mulching around a grape plant may allow for rabbits and other smaller mammals to hide easily from predators. So that's sometimes why having that bare ground should help, keep rabbits from really getting there with it. But it's very unlike, say, birds, where we can say get bird netting to keep birds from grapes, the deer, the smaller mammals, it's going to be trying to kind of experiment with different ways and procedures.
So, Grant, I was thinking about earlier when we were talking about diseases, and we mentioned black rot and the mildews, and you have the same pressures in Northern Illinois with those diseases. same diseases and we see that in Southern Illinois as well. What about issues with insects? I think some of our bigger insect problems can be grape berry moth. I remember I spent a summer helping Dr. Weinzierl with one of his research projects where, so I was on the hunt for the grape berry moth for a few months one summer in several of the vineyards here in Southern Illinois. But there's that insect, and also for us, the multicolored Asian lady beetles. Do you have those same insect pressures in Northern Illinois as well?
We do, yeah. I mean, so some of those insects are coming in sometimes similar to the same time as your grape diseases are. And so of course that's just making yet again an entry point for disease to move in and disease pressure to become a big problem. Of course, we have Japanese beetle issues. It can't be said that the Japanese beetles can just defoliate grapevines really easily. I think about 4 or 5 years ago, I was at a hop field in Wisconsin, and they had hops and grapes, and all the Japanese beetles were going to the grapes. So it worked great for, if you were a hop farmer, because, right, exactly, you've got a great trap crop, which is not a good thing if you're a grape grower, is because this foliage, this leaf material can really attract Japanese beetles and attract some of these other major insect pest problems that we see. So certainly, especially as some of the grapes begin to ripen, I think it's still really important to try to use some insect traps if it's recommended, or if it works for certain insects. We of course don't recommend insect traps for Japanese beetles, because you always have way more Japanese beetles than you would ever have. But certainly, knowing that, okay, you have to do some fungicide application, you're probably going to have to use some insecticide application too, if you get to a certain threshold for some of these insects. Netting might work for Japanese beetles. I don't think it's going to be the same type of netting that would address birds though. So it might be now you have 2 different types of netting.
I think, yeah, and sometimes one of the challenges or considerations if you're netting for insect control, especially on grapes, because usually they're grown vertically in some capacity, is then, all right, you have to make sure that you can secure the bottom edges. It's one thing to deter birds that, well, they can hop down the ground and get up in there. They're not going to do that. They're more going to, they're going to head down from the top right and try to land in. So whereas insects, we have to be a lot more on our A game, right? They'll sneak in and crawl in, and we have to be more kind of completely exclusive. So, but yeah, that's some of these insect pests can be a big. The lady beetles one I know is one of the main things is just the quality. For that's more in the wine grape side, is they're all finding a nice happy home about harvest time, and you get them into clusters, and then just if you ever smashed one of those, we can only imagine what a batch of wine with some of those in it would taste like. So yeah, not something pleasant or really easy to remove. And I think a pretty low threshold for tolerance for them. Even I think a few can kind of give an off flavor, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is one that, especially even how you're going to apply some of these insecticides, just knowing where these insect pressure is going to be may mean that you're not investing in that kind of maybe traditional just spray pack or spray pump rather to apply it. You may have to be really more mindful of where these insects are with it.
Yeah, one of the things I remember from Dr. Weinzierl's project on that grape berry moth was that they would lay the eggs on the cluster when the fruit cluster was still relatively small, and then and they could be on the backside of the fruit where you don't see them. Then as that fruit sizes and the individual grapes start to grow together, when that egg hatches, and then that insect is feeding on multiple grapes within the cluster. And so, it ends up messing up a whole cluster from just one egg because of where it was placed. And so I think that's a good example of having, whether it's an insecticide or a fungicide, making sure that you're able to apply that on all surfaces, not just over the top of the canopy, but up within the canopy on the grapes, especially.
Right. And yeah, I think occasionally folks will ask, is it possible to do organic production with grapes? And it's just, yet again, it's that crop that you're going to have to expect to apply insecticides, and these insecticides are pretty expensive, and you may have to apply them pretty regularly, and there's not as many of them either. And the same is true for fungicides. Any organic fungicides for some of these diseases is just going to be potentially pretty expensive and may not work as well compared to some of the others. It's possible, but just know that it's such a higher level of management and investment, and finding access to some of those sprays too.
I think on a home scale is a little different than if you're trying to commercially grow them, and then especially the level of quality you might accept just for a few homeowner versus the level of quality you need to have to sell those to a winemaker or something. As far as maybe if there's clusters that do have a few disease berries, maybe it's something as a homeowner maybe you could work around, or you could do that. But are you going to do that with totes and totes and totes of you have hundreds of pounds of grapes? Are you going to be able to handle that, say in a situation where they're mechanically destemming and other things? Probably not. So that's where certainly considering that, and then certainly some of your fungicide cost as you go in that larger scale. There's just a few crops that in our area, they're just, I wouldn't say that, like you said, organic production can be done, but there's definitely, is it on a commercial scale, is it viable? Can you get a high enough yield of a quality crop that you can market and make it worthwhile to cover all those inputs? So just things to consider and just kind of be aware of, if nothing else, as you're trying to establish that plan.
Yeah, completely. And I think you bring up a great point. I mean, like accepting, kind of what the scale you're at and what your fruit expectations are. A beginning backyard vineyard, a couple of plants out there, you could probably get away with not spraying if that's what you so chose. If I was a mixed vegetable operation and sold at farmers markets or CSAs or somewhere, putting out some grapes, some table grapes would be a pretty good opportunity. And I could supplement that into my markets. I could also even use them for value-added production even. So making some of my jams, jellies, or anything else that I'm able to under some of those cottage food laws could be another avenue to consider with it too.
All right, well, I guess one final thought that I have, if no one else has anything, is, so of all, especially thinking of table grapes, does anyone have any favorite table grape variety? I will say that I had a chance to try Jupiter, and that has still been one of my favorites. Has a really unique flavor. It's a like a purplish colored table grape, but we had whenever I did work at SIU, and we had a variety trial, some table grapes, and I'll be honest, I don't remember all of the variety names, but there were some pink ones, and I know Mars is another one that I have. I know Marquis is another one, but there were some really good seedless table grape varieties that I almost felt ashamed to eat a Thompson seedless after that, because the flavors and stuff were just way, I mean, it was just, you just like, wow, this is a grape, like this tastes nothing like the grapes that I'm used to. So Bronwyn, you have any favorites you remember from your days?
That's going back several years. I tell you, one variety that I do remember from that trial was a variety called Sunbelt. And it was I think maybe they were marketing it as a replacement for Concord, because it was very much it tasted just like a Concord, but they said that one of the benefits of this variety was that it allowed for more even ripening. I think maybe sometimes Concord you can see some uneven ripening within the clusters, but I remember that variety in particular. I made sure when we were harvesting, I kept all of those clusters separate, and I kind of hoarded those to myself, and I went home and made jelly out of those. So I did not share those with everyone else at work. But made really great jelly, so I like that variety.
So this is the second year for my 3. So I won't have grapes this year. I should have them next year. But I have I've got Edelweiss, which is a table grape. It's a white table grape. I think I've also got Somerset, which is a seedless red. And then I also believe I think I have King of the North. And King of the North is like a wine grape. So it's blue. It's very hardy. But it's also one that is good for wine, and you can also make juice or jelly out of it. So those were kind of the 3 that I chose, just to have a little bit of a mixture of different ones with it. So we'll hopefully have grapes to talk about next year is the goal.
Now I'm gonna have to try more grape varieties.
Well, I will tell you, Katie, that reference I made in the presentation for the Iowa State Grape Production Guide is fantastic. It's a little bit older, but I mean, for us to be able to recommend grape varieties, I really highly recommend that guide, because it just goes through everything you need to know about sometimes over 125 different grapes out there, because we're just so used to the Concord or just a singular one out there, whereas there's so many Midwestern grapes that we just don't know about.
Yeah, even some of the some of the table grapes, although it seems a little bit of a waste in a way, but I know like some of Jupiter make awesome grape jelly. Like really, you can still taste some of those flavors and stuff. So even some of the even some of the value added with some of that, I think could be some opportunity, especially for a farm market. Trying to give some unique something other than the standard Concord jelly. I think you could market that with those variety names, and I think draw some interest. So.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here with me today. You will find my great presentation on the Illinois Extension Local Foods and Small Farms YouTube, or by visiting go.illinois.edu/SFWW2022 YouTube. And thank all 3 of you for being here today with me, and have a good rest of your day.
All right, you
You
too.
too.